It's been just over a year since Doctor Who Season 1 first aired, but what do I think about the season over a year later? Okay, so obviously it's been just over a year since Doctor Who Season 1 first aired. I was originally going to have this video out a couple of weeks ago, so that it would have been better timed to be a year on from the first season of Doctor Who, this new era of Doctor Who airing. My original plan was to get this out on the 22nd of June because number one, that would have been a Sunday, which is when I usually put my videos out, and it would have also been exactly a year since the airing of Empire of Death, the final episode of that season. But unfortunately, I just kind of ran out of time to get that video made in that time. I had a lot of stuff going on, so I didn't really have time to make it. I probably should have planned it out a little bit better and filmed it a little bit before, but obviously I was also covering the second season of Doctor Who just before all that, so I kind of ran out of time with that. So this video is a little bit late, but it's still about a year after Doctor Who Season 1 has aired, so it still roughly works, but it is like a couple weeks too late for what I originally planned. But with all that being said, let's get on to my thoughts about Doctor Who Season 1 a year later, starting with my review for Space Babies. Okay, so this episode opens immediately after the Church on Ruby Road with some of the same shots and some new refilmed moments of what we'd already seen at the very end of that episode, kicking off right where we left off with Ruby's first adventure, which the Doctor sets to a random landing, taking them to the dinosaurs, where we get a fun butterfly effect moment which we basically saw in the trailers. Now this is a pretty fun scene overall, but it doesn't add too much to the episode, and it does feel a little bit disconnected, but I do think this is possibly a Disney edition, and it's not really a bad scene. It is kind of useful to kind of show the time traveling capabilities of the TARDIS and introduce it to new audiences on Disney Plus and any other new audiences that are watching. So like I said, this isn't like a bad scene or anything. It's a fairly fun scene, but for me personally, it doesn't add too much to the episode, and I do feel like it could have been a Disney Plus edition. And I think Ruby and the Doctor's chemistry in this episode is absolutely amazing, as can be said for the next episode as well. One of the standout moments of this in this episode is the Doctor's reaction to Ruby giving the 5 digits for the year when he's probably expecting just a 4-digit year. Now there's also a lot of exposition in this episode, which is expected. This is the start of a new era and it's introducing the show to a new audience, particularly those on Disney Plus. So I get why it's in here, but there is quite a lot of it in this episode. Now it does mostly feel natural. A lot of it is motivated by Ruby asking the Doctor questions. However, some of the exposition in this episode that the Doctor gives does sometimes feel a little bit unmotivated and unprompted, with the Doctor just randomly telling Ruby things that she hasn't asked about. But like I said, it does kind of make sense because they need to introduce these things to a new audience, but some of it could have been done a little bit more naturally, and some of it was. We also get a hint at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with a chilling scene of the Doctor and Ruby's memory of the Church on Ruby Road bleeding through into reality, with the snow coming through into the spaceship, which like I said was just a really chilling scene and a really good way at hinting at the story arc that we're going to get in the future. But I'll talk more about Ruby's story arc in my review for The Devil's Chord. So obviously in this episode we have the titular Space Babies, which is a very silly concept but quite a fun idea. It's definitely an odd choice for the opening episode of the season, unless you count the Church on Ruby Road as the opening episode. But then again, we did have Partners in Crime, which had Living Fat in that episode, so it's not too far off a standard RTD opener. This also allows for us to finally get a Doctor moment for Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor, where he's talking to Captain Poppy, explaining to them that they haven't grown up wrong and that nobody grows up wrong, which I think is a really nice message for this episode, and like I said, a very Doctor-y moment, which I'm glad we finally got to see from the 15th Doctor, and it obviously sets up the ending of this episode quite nicely. I've seen a lot of people complaining about the CGI of the talking babies, which, while it doesn't look the best, such as the reactions on their faces not suiting the dialogue, I think the effect is done as well as it could have been. So I don't really know what people would have wanted besides them maybe talking telepathically or something along those lines, but for me personally, I don't think it looks too bad for as well as it could have been done, basically. For me personally, it wasn't too distracting, but it definitely helps that the babies take a bit of a backseat after we're introduced to Jocelyn. And talking about the Space Babies, the Doctor does say Space Babies maybe one too many times, and it did start to get a little bit annoying. We're also introduced to the character of Jocelyn, or Nan-E, who was a very fun character. I really liked the introduction of this character, at first thinking that she was just an AI, for her then to get annoyed at the Doctor and break character telling him to hurry up. And on those same lines, the Nan-E filter allows for a lot of fun comedic comedic moments with censoring of expletives throughout this episode as a kind of running joke. The character of Jocelyn also allows for a really nice emotional moment in this episode where she explains why she's been hiding away from the babies, as she doesn't want to see them die or for them to see her die as well. There's also some really good political commentary in this episode with a focus on reproductive rights, with the babies being forced to be born but there being no obligation or assistance to look after them, with Ruby making a comment that it's not unlike our world, which definitely feels like a bit of a jab at the US right now. As well as this, there's also the political commentary on refugees, with the planet that accepts refugees not coming to collect them, as you physically have to show up there. However, although I do think this political commentary is good, that is basically the extent of the political commentary in this episode. It's just a couple of lines that aren't really elaborated on throughout the rest of the episode. So they maybe could have gone a little bit further there, but I do think it was still done really well and was definitely some good moments for this episode. We obviously also have the Bogeyman in this episode, which I think was a very fun, fairly standard Doctor Who monster that works really well for an opening episode. I think the hints at where it came from are very clever in this episode, not giving it away too quickly, although I had seen people speculating that the monster would have been made out of bogies before the episode had aired, so I kind of figured it out a little bit early on. But I particularly like the Doctor being confused as to why he ran away, for it to be revealed that it's because it was created with the intention of it being scary for the babies. I really liked the comedy in the reveal of the Bogeyman being made out of bogies. Once again, the Doctor and Ruby's chemistry is just great in this episode, and that's a great showcase of that. And obviously this episode ends with the Doctor saving the Bogeyman, which is very characteristic of the Doctor, and it does make sense with it being the only one of its kind as set up earlier on in the episode. However, it does still feel a bit weird as it's made to be the antagonist of the episode. Obviously it's technically fine, as I assume the Bogeyman was never actually going to kill the babies, as it was only designed to scare them, not kill them. But I do feel like there could have been more of an attempt to get the audience to empathise with it after the reveal, as it still feels a bit weird that the Doctor wants to save it, even if it does make sense character-wise. Maybe there could have been a line hinting at the fact that it was weird that the Bogeyman didn't kill Eric when it easily could have done, or something along those lines, just to prove that it was only designed to scare them and not kill them. Because I can imagine a lot of the audience were left thinking that now they've left the Bogeyman alive, it's just going to kill the babies, which I'm pretty sure isn't the intention. Overall, I think this was a perfectly fine opening episode, if not a bit sillier than usual. It establishes the Doctor and Ruby's relationship and dynamic really well, and it also establishes the concepts of the show to new viewers in a pretty natural and organic way for the most part. Although, like I said, there are some unmotivated moments of exposition in this episode. And there's also some nice hints at the further story arcs of the season in there as well. Compared to previous RTD openers, I think it's actually very similar. In my opinion, his opening episodes usually aren't the best in terms of their plot, and this episode is exactly the same. His opening episodes are usually more about the characters and introducing the audience than they are about the actual plot of the episode, so I think this one is fairly standard in terms of RTD openers, if not a bit sillier than some of his previous ones. When it comes to opening episodes in Doctor Who, I think the Moffat era did a much better job at openers, so like I said, in my opinion, Space Babies is actually a fairly standard RTD opener. Like I said, I liked this episode for the most part, but overall it was just okay. It's definitely the weaker out of the two first episodes of this season, which obviously I'll get into more next week when I review The Devil's Chord. I think if I was to put this episode on a tier list, I'd probably rank it at C, maybe B tier at a push, but for now I think I'm going to leave it at C, and maybe I'll change it up later on when we get to see the rest of the episode. So what do I think of Space Babies a year later? Honestly, I think when I first watched this episode, I didn't hate it that much. I know a lot of people did, but I didn't love it either, and I think the main thing for me is I just think it's a very weird opening episode for the show. I think it would have worked better if it was somewhere in the middle of the season, but I think it's a very divisive episode to have as the season opener, and basically the start of a new era. Obviously we had the Church on Ruby Road before, which was introducing the Doctor and Ruby, but this episode is kind of here to introduce all the aspects of the show, like the TARDIS and all that stuff, to Ruby as a character, which it definitely does in this episode, but it does kind of rush through it all in this one episode instead of gradually introducing it, which I think is fair enough because a lot of us have seen that before, but for new viewers it would have maybe been nice to not just throw it all at them at once. But obviously, like I was saying, this episode is a bit of a silly one to kind of start the season off with. We've got the talking babies and the farting spaceship and the monster made out of bogies and stuff like that, which Like I said, I don't hate this episode, but I don't think it's great, and I think it's just a particularly weird episode to start with. And I thought that at the time, but I probably think it even more a year on, especially with us having the Robot Revolution as a season opener in season 2, which I think was a much better season opener, even if that episode still was kind of not one of the best of all time. I think it still worked much better as a season opener than this did. Okay, so this episode opens with a very classic Russell T Davies cold open, introducing us to the main villain of the episode, Maestro, who I think is a great villain, portrayed incredibly by Jinx Monsoon, who I just think did an incredible job in this episode. I know for some people the performance is a little bit over the top, but for me personally, I think it works perfectly for this episode. Although Jinx Monsoon has recently come out as trans, the character of Maestro is stated to be non-binary in the cold open of this episode. Now, let me know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think the non-binary nature of this character really works in their favour, as after all they are a godlike entity, being the child of the toy maker. So them being non-binary I think really works to show how powerful and out of this world this character is, if that makes sense. They're a sort of nebulous entity, so I think making them non-binary and giving them that non-binary identity really helps to reinforce that. And like I just mentioned, Maestro is confirmed to be a child of the toy maker and part of the pantheon and a god of chaos, which I think is a really clever way of setting the stakes of this villain and a really easy way to relay to the audience how powerful of a force they are, as anybody who's seen the 60th anniversary specials and particularly the Giggle knows just how powerful this character should be if they are a child of the toy maker. And this also really helps to reinforce the Doctor's fear when he figures out who Maestro is and that they're related to the toy maker with the Giggle early on in the episode. Okay, so the first scene we get after the cold open and the title sequence is with the Doctor and Ruby, and this is one of my favourite scenes we've had of them so far. Once again, their dynamic is on full display, with the Doctor pretending he doesn't like Ruby's suggestion of going to see the Beatles to actually trick her and show how happy he is that she said that. I also love the moment and the shot we get of them changing into their 1960s outfits, even though it is a bit weird that Ruby is already in an outfit that wouldn't seem out of place in the first place. But like I said, it allows for us to have that really nice moment and that great shot of them changing into their outfits, which I think is one of the best directed shots we've had in the season so far. Now, the weird thing about this episode is there is a 6-month time jump for some reason, which I think was a very odd mention in the script, and for me personally it's not really a good decision for the second episode of the season. I've seen some people mention that this might have been done to have a gap for Big Finish and other expanded media, which is fine, but if so, I feel like it should have been done later on in the season than it was here, because we're just getting used to the characters and we really want to see their relationship develop in these early episodes. So I think having a 6-month time jump in between episode 1 and 2 was a pretty big mistake in my opinion. I've seen some people speculate that this episode was originally intended to be later in the season, which I think is definitely likely. However, Ruby suggesting to go and see the Beatles early on in this episode sounds like it would have been her first request after their first adventure in Space Babies, and my personal theory for how this episode was going to start is that it was going to take place immediately after the first episode, with this adventure being Ruby's first suggestion after their first adventure, which would also have justified the 2-episode premiere, as these episodes could have taken place immediately after each other, which would have made a lot more sense in my opinion. And I'm personally surprised they didn't just ADR the scene where June or July of 2024 is mentioned instead of Christmas, because I'm pretty sure the Doctor is both far away enough and maybe even facing away from the camera that I think an overdubbed line in the scene would have worked pretty seamlessly. We also get mentions of the Doctor's granddaughter Susan in this episode, which I believe is the first time she's been properly mentioned by name in all of the New Era, although I guess this is technically another New Era anyway. Now, most of the exposition so far has been something that is important for the new audience to know and catch them up to speed, which this isn't. So it does feel like this is something that wouldn't be mentioned unless it's going to be brought up again later on in the season. And we do know that Susan Twist is playing a character called Susan Triad in the finale, so it's possible that there's a connection there, and maybe we're going to see Susan later on in the season, or Susan's going to be Susan Triad or related to Susan Triad or something along those lines. But let me know what you think about that in the comments below. We also have some more hints at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with more memories bleeding through into reality like in the previous episode, and Maestro mentions a character called the Oldest One who was apparently present during Ruby's birth. I know some people have been speculating recently that this could be the Trickster. I'm not sure how likely that is, but let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And Maestro once again reminds us that the one who waits is coming, which some people have speculated could be Sutek, which I'd love if that was true, but I don't know how likely that is. Again, let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. But this could be more evidence that this episode was meant to air later in the season, possibly right before the finale, as I'm pretty sure Maestro says the one who waits is closer than we think, so you'd think that'd be a bit later on in the season. Obviously, this episode sees the Doctor and Ruby going to see the Beatles record their first album, only for them to see that the Beatles, Cilla Black, and this orchestra are all playing terrible music, which I think makes for one of the best moments in this whole episode. I love both of their reactions to all of the musicians playing terrible music. I think it's a hilarious moment of the episode, and I think the Ruby and Doctor's reactions are perfect. Although the quote-unquote bad music that the Beatles are playing honestly isn't too far off something the Beatles would have made. Think I Am the Walrus or Octopus's Garden, but it's still a hilarious moment nonetheless. Speaking of the Beatles, I knew they weren't going to feature heavily in this episode. My prediction was that they would be trapped in their instruments most of the episode, and so I don't really mind that much that they don't look a whole lot like the Beatles. However, I do think it is really unfortunate that George and Ringo are pretty much sidelined for this episode, with us only focusing on John and Paul. But with that being said, I do really like the conclusion to the threat being those two coming together to play the chord that banishes Maestro. And of course, this episode ends with a final big musical number. Now, for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, but I was expecting a musical number in this episode and was personally quite excited for it because I wanted to see how they'd do it, and it's something new for Doctor Who. However, the musical number at the end of this episode just didn't work for me. It didn't feel justified in the plot at all for me and just felt ultimately a bit tacked on. And the song itself just also isn't very good. It's nearly as bad as the made up bad songs earlier on in the episode. I've seen some people suggest that it should have been used to defeat Maestro in the music battle instead, which, although being more justified in the plot, I personally wouldn't have preferred that, as I think the music battle sequence is perfect as it is, besides that one cringy music battle line. It also doesn't really make sense in the plot, as Maestro has already been defeated, so we're kind of left questioning why this is happening in the first place. I think the intention was meant to be that Maestro's domain was still lingering, like at the end of the giggle. I'm pretty sure I've heard there was a line from the script that was not included or something like that that hinted at that, but I think there really needed to be a line or two in the episode explaining that, because it just wasn't clear and made the musical number feel even more tacked on than it already was. Overall, I think this was a very good episode of the show, with a great villain in Jinx Monsoon's Maestro. It is almost up there with Wild Blue Yonder for me. However, it's slightly let down by the tacked on musical number at the end, which doesn't have much of a function in the plot, and by some poor mistakes in either editing or episode placement, with that 6-month time jump and potentially other things that were cut from the episode. If I were to rank this episode on a tier list, I'm mostly thinking I'd give it an A rank at the moment, but it could go down to a B rank depending on if my thoughts on it change a little bit later on down the line, and depending on the later episodes of this season, depending on how good they are. But for now, I'm going to put it at A rank, but maybe that'll change later on down the line. Okay, so what do I think of The Devil's Chord a year later? The Devil's Chord is an interesting one because I do think it was a good episode of this particular season, but there are some things that I don't like about this episode, and particularly now that we've had Lux from season 2, which is obviously a very similar episode, not only in it being the second episode of the season, but also just a lot of the general vibes of the episode. I think Lux works a lot better than The Devil's Chord for me personally. Although I like The Devil's Chord for the most part, there's some things that I don't like about it, like we don't really see much of what's happening in the outside world, which I thought was a little bit weird. We're very strictly limited to just a few characters, mostly just the Doctor, Ruby, and Maestro. We don't even really get to see the Beatles all that much in this episode. They're more of like a glorified cameo that then comes back to solve the problem at the end of the episode. And then we do get a musical number in this episode like people were expecting, but I would have expected us to have a musical number somewhere in the middle of the episode instead of at the end after the problem has been solved. And that particular moment just feels really out of place to me, because like I said, the particular problem of the episode has been solved, but there's still all this otherworldly stuff going on with the musical number, and I just don't think the musical number itself is that good. The song itself is pretty bad, and like I said, it just feels really out of place to me and kind of lets the ending of the episode down a little bit. But besides that, I don't really mind this episode all that much. I think it's a good episode of this season, but like I said, now that we've had Lux in season 2, which I personally think was a lot better, which also had a bit of a weird scene in it with that fan scene, but for me personally, I quite liked that fan scene more than I was expecting to, whereas I know for sure that I did not like the musical number scene in this episode, The Devil's Chord, even though I was expecting a musical number and would have liked to have seen a musical number in this episode. I just think the way they went about doing it felt really out of place when they could have done it somewhere else in the episode. But with all that being said, we do obviously have Maestro in this episode, which, like I said in the review, I think Maestro is great. I do think Lux, or Mr. Ring-a-Ding, was better in Lux than Maestro was, but I do still quite like Maestro, and I think Jinx Monsoon did a great performance in that episode. So it's still a pretty good episode, but like I said, there are a few issues I have with it, and I think Lux is just kind of a better version of this kind of similar story, even though they're obviously a little bit different. Okay, so this episode opens with a fairly extended cold open, perfectly setting up all the threads in this episode, such as the ambulances not being a good thing in this scenario, the effect the landmine has and how it works, as well as the guest characters that are relevant to the episode. And it does all of that, as well as the Doctor stepping on a landmine before the titles even start. We're also introduced to Varada Sethu's character in this cold open of this episode, who I thought did a great job in this story, and I'm very excited to see her return again next season as the companion, presumably as a new character from what we can tell, but it might somehow be related to this character in some way. But I talked more about that in the first impressions video. We did know she was going to be showing up earlier than season 2, but I wasn't expecting it to be this early, and it was a nice surprise. And like I said, I think she was great in this episode. We also get a number of other guest characters in this episode. Obviously there's the relationship between Mundi and Kanto, which, although wasn't the most convincing thing ever, I did genuinely cry when Kanto dies and she's speaking to the hologram. But I can see why some people didn't quite believe their relationship. And I can also see what some people were saying with the casting of Splice. It does seem like she was meant to be maybe played by a younger actor, and that would have probably worked a little bit better, but you know, casting for child actors is probably not the easiest thing in the world. As mentioned, this episode mostly consists of the Doctor being stuck on a landmine for most of the episode, unable to move, and I just think this episode is a masterclass in tension and suspense from Stephen Moffat, particularly the moment where Splice is running towards the Doctor and Ruby has to try and stop her, as well as the moment where Ruby is shot and the Doctor can't do anything about it. I think those moments were just great and really suspenseful and had a lot of tension in them. But just overall, this whole episode was incredibly tense, and Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's performance were incredible, particularly Ncuti Gatwa, as obviously Millie Gibson, or Ruby Sunday I should say, was dead for a lot of the episode, or dying for a lot of the episode, so was out of action for quite a lot of it. And if you weren't already convinced that Ncuti Gatwa is the Doctor before this episode, you certainly should be now. Now, as mentioned, there are a number of different themes throughout this episode, one of which is the theme around AI, particularly with the ambulances and the Villain Guard algorithm, which I've seen some people aren't the biggest fan of this theme, because it seems to be suggesting that AI isn't bad unless it's good AI, or that AI is bad until it isn't. However, I personally didn't read it that way. I personally took this as a message of humanity over AI, with the AI of John Francis Veta representing the humanity defeating the AI, not just that his AI is a good AI and the AI can be good, but I can personally see how people read it that way instead. As mentioned in my first impressions video, I think the theme that I latched onto the most was definitely the capitalism and warfare theme throughout this episode, and the revelation of the Anglicans actually fighting nobody, they're on an empty planet, although easy to predict, was a great one in my opinion. There is of course the theme of faith and religion throughout this episode as well, with the Doctor almost criticising faith in a way throughout the episode, but I think it's nice that it ends on a positive note with the Doctor seeing the benefits of it at the end of the episode. I know a lot of people are very annoyed about the Doctor's reaction or thoughts on faith in this episode, and they think it's very out of character for the Doctor, which I can see, but like I said, he does come around to it in the end, and I think a big part of that is just that he's obviously going to be a lot more spiteful early on in the episode whilst he's stuck on a landmine, and you know, he thinks Ruby's dead and there's nothing he can do about it, so I can kind of understand why he's more spiteful towards the other characters about faith and religion at the start, and why he's much more accepting of it at the end, when you take into consideration that he's under a lot of stress and pressure throughout the episode. So for me personally, I think it works quite well. Now, there's also a number of references in this episode, not only to previous Moffat episodes such as Villain Guard, the Anglican Marines, Fish Fingers and Custard, and the Doctor saying basically in a similar way to how he says basically run as the 11th Doctor, but also references to other eras such as the Doctor singing the Skyboat song, which is a song that the second Doctor has played on his recorder, as well as the reference to the mud aliens from the Witchfinders. I appreciate a lot of these references because they're kind of, some of them are almost like deep cuts, such as Villain Guard that was only barely mentioned in Empty Child Doctor Dances. Some of them are a little bit more obvious, like Fish Fingers and Custard, but I appreciate that Moffat returned and didn't just write like another Weeping Angel story or reintroduce the silence or something like that. So I think these references are quite nice, and it's obviously nice that some of the references aren't just to previous Moffat era episodes or episodes that Moffat has written before. There's obviously a few more story arc hints throughout this episode as well, with Ruby not knowing who her next of kin is, and the snow showing up again in the episode, which I think is very interesting to see. And also obviously Susan Twist is in this episode as well. I think my only issue with all of these story arc hints throughout the past few episodes is that we've had the same hints with the snow and Susan Twist in every episode so far. I think that's just kind of a downside of having a shorter episode count for this season, but it would have maybe been nice if we had these hints maybe every other episode instead of every episode as well. But there's obviously more hints at the Doctor's family as well in this episode, with him saying things like dad to dad and stuff like that, which could be more hints towards Susan returning towards the end of this season or at some point in this era. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Overall, I think this episode was a masterclass in tension and suspense, and in my opinion, it's a new all-timer from Stephen Moffat. This episode explores some great themes around AI, capitalism and warfare, and faith, with some nice references to not only previous Moffat episodes, but also other episodes from both the classic era and modern eras of the show. I'd personally say this is probably my favourite episode of the 15th Doctor era so far, and in terms of the RTD2 era, it's definitely up there with Wild Blue Yonder, probably the best episode since that. So for that reason, I'm mostly thinking of putting this episode in S tier, with the potential for it to be moved down to A tier if anything in this season somehow tops this episode.
Okay, so what do I think of Boom 1 year later? So Boom is one of my favourite episodes of this season. I think it's a really great episode, and it did have me excited for what Stephen Moffat would also be doing in this era, which unfortunately was Joy to the World, which I think wasn't a great episode, but I'm glad that he at least came back for Boom because it is one of his best episodes, and he's always better, or usually better, when he's writing outside of his own era, is probably what I would have said actually, but then we had Joy to the World, so I'm not really sure. But I think this is just such a simple concept of an episode of the Doctor being stuck on a landmine for the whole episode, which then leads to this masterclass in tension and suspense, like I said in the review, which I think is just done perfectly, and I think it's a great bottle episode, which often tend to be some of the best episodes of the show when it's just a simple bottle episode concept. So my thoughts on this episode haven't really changed much a year later, because I really liked it when I first saw it, and I still think it's a great episode now. And obviously now that we're a year on from this, we also had Varada Sethu in this episode playing Mundi Flynn, who obviously then went on to play Belinda Chandra, which we've now seen. And I think Belinda Chandra is a great companion in season 2, but unfortunately I think they did let her down with a lot of the stories and sidelining her in a lot of the episodes, particularly in the finale. But she is great in Boom as Mundi Flynn, and I can see why this led them to cast her as the new companion for season 2.
So obviously, like I said, the Doctor disappears at the start of this episode, which leaves Ruby Sunday on her own for the rest of the episode as the main character of this episode. This gives Millie Gibson the perfect opportunity to shine as Ruby Sunday in this episode, where she gives a great performance, which is really impressive considering this is the first episode she filmed of this season. If Boom is the episode that should sell you on Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor, then 73 Yards is the episode that should sell you on Millie Gibson as Ruby Sunday. So Ruby also bumps into Susan Twist again in this episode as the hiker, but this time she actually recognizes her from the previous episode, forwarding this Susan Twist story arc a little bit further than it has been for the past few episodes, where the Doctor and Ruby haven't even really noticed her before. We then get a very good and tense scene in the pub. I know some people don't really like its portrayal of Welsh people, but bear in mind this is written by Russell T Davies, who is himself Welsh. I love the reveal of them just messing with Ruby. It makes you unsure of how much, if any, of what they said is actually true or real. I personally think none of it is real and it's just a red herring, but it's a really nice way of sowing some seeds of what could be happening in this episode and what the explanations could be, leaving the audience to kind of figure out which of the things they've said is actually true and actually happening. We also get the scenes with Ruby's mum, Carla, as well as Kate Stewart and Unit, where they're both turned away from Ruby after speaking to the woman, which really just shows how alone Ruby is with all this and how no one is able to help her. And the scene with Kate Stewart has a really great line in it, which I think is very important to this episode, but I'll touch on that more later on. on. So after all this happens, we then get a time jump to Ruby when she's about 40, I think. It is a little bit weird that the way that they've decided to age her up is basically just by putting glasses on her. I'm pretty sure from Unleashed you can see that she does technically have some prosthetics on. There's like some slight wrinkles in her forehead and stuff like that. And I think she was also coached on how to walk as if she was a 40-year-old. But that's honestly not that noticeable, so it does kind of just look like they've put some glasses on her, which is kind of funny. But for me personally, it doesn't really bother me that much. I thought Roger Ap Gwilliam was a good antagonist for this episode. My only issue is how long it takes to get to him and how little he's focused on in the episode. I know I've seen some people that aren't so happy about the whole abuse that is implied in this episode, which I fully appreciate and understand. For me, I think it really helps to show how terrible and obsessed with power he is, but I can see why those implied moments just kind of really aren't needed for some people and feel a little bit weird. In terms of Roger Ap Gwilliam himself, I think my personal interpretation is I personally like to think that he's just a normal human who is obsessed with power, and that him mentioning that his nickname was Mad Jack is just a coincidence that reminds Ruby of the Doctor mentioning him and what he did at the start of the episode. Hence why when Ruby uses the woman to make Roger Ap Gwilliam resign, she doesn't disappear until Ruby dies, as I think that's not what she was there for. I personally think there isn't actually a reason why the woman is there, but Ruby just finds one and makes one up, which I think is hinted at by what Kate says earlier on in the episode, where she says, "It's what we do, all of us. We see something inexplicable and invent the rules to make it work." However, other people obviously are going to interpret this in a different way. That Mad Jack is an entity set free by the Doctor stepping in the fairy circle that is either possessed or manifested into Roger Ap Gwilliam, which I think is just as valid of an interpretation and personally what this episode is all about. The ambiguity of elements like this is personally what makes this episode so good in my opinion, but I'll get into that more later on. But before I get into most people's main issue with this episode, I think my main issue with this episode is the pacing and the political elements that seem a little bit rushed and half-baked. They sort of come out of nowhere, and I feel like this episode could have maybe benefited from being a two-parter, especially considering you can tell that they've tried to fit a lot into this episode, and it still ended up being 47 minutes long, which is longer than all the other episodes we've got so far in this season, and they still couldn't fit a title sequence at the start of this episode, although that might have been a creative decision. Either way, I think the lack of title sequence works for this. But yeah, I do think this maybe could have benefited from being a two-parter, with part one ending with Ruby seeing Roger Ap Gwilliam on the TV announcing that he is running for Prime Minister, and her remembering what the Doctor said about him, and then part two focusing on the political elements and Ruby trying to take down Roger Ap Gwilliam. Okay, so obviously a lot of people weren't happy with the ending of this episode as it leaves a lot of things unexplained. However, whilst I understand that criticism, it personally doesn't bother me. I personally like that this episode doesn't have an explanation for anything at the end. I think people are just so used to Doctor Who having a technobabble explanation behind it, but I think this episode really benefits from not having one, as it allows for some really unique and interesting interpretations, with people interpreting a lot of the elements of this episode in different and creative ways, such as my interpretation with Roger Ap Gwilliam. The comparison I made on Twitter is you wouldn't watch Donnie Darko, for example, and complain that nothing in that film makes sense. The whole point of that film and this episode is that it's all up to the viewer's interpretation. The difference here is that Doctor Who is a sci-fi show that usually has a logical explanation to everything, although I guess technically Donnie Darko is sci-fi horror, which this episode sort of is as well. However, with that being said, I do understand some of the criticisms. For example, if Ruby is the woman, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum? I think that doesn't make too much sense when you think about it, but personally I don't think the solution to that would be knowing what the woman is saying. Not knowing what the woman was saying is personally one of my favourite things about this episode, as it leaves a lot to the audience's imagination, and whatever it would have been revealed to be is not going to be as good as what you could think of in your head, or what you don't know. So I really don't know what they could have done there. Maybe not making Ruby be the woman or something like that, but I personally don't think finding out what the woman was saying is the solution to that. The woman also isn't played by the same person who plays the older version of Ruby, so I guess maybe Ruby only inhabits the woman's body for a short period of time at the end or something like that. I think the main difference in whether or not people came out of this episode enjoying it or not mostly came down to how people approached the episode. I feel like people who didn't really like this episode or are annoyed about the ending of this episode approached this as a mystery that was going to be solved, which isn't really their own fault. But myself, and I assume the other people who also really liked this episode, were just along for the ride and saw it as more of an episode that was taking us us on a journey. A lot of people are also annoyed, saying that all of this was pointless because Ruby doesn't remember it and lost all of her character growth, but I personally disagree with that because she says at the end of the episode that she's been to Wales 3 times instead of 2 times like she said at the start. So although she doesn't actually seem to remember any of it, it's definitely stayed with her somehow, which to me suggests that the character growth that she gets in this episode has also stayed with her, even if she can't fully remember what happened. I've also seen a lot of people saying that they hope we get more answers later on in the season about this episode, but I personally don't hope we get any answers later on in the season, and I don't think we will. Like I said, for me, the ambiguity is what makes this episode, and so explaining things later on down the line would personally ruin it for me. And I also think it just seems like this story is finished, as much as people would like some explanations for it. I just personally don't see it being revisited, and personally don't want it to be, but that's just my opinion. Overall, I think 73 Yards is a great episode that thrives on ambiguity. However, some of the political content in this episode does feel somewhat rushed and half-baked, and could have maybe benefited from being 2 parts. This episode leaves you with more questions than answers, which for the most part I think is to its benefit, and leaves you thinking about it long after it's finished. However, some of the questions do bring up some genuine criticisms, such as if the woman is meant to be Ruby, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum and turn her against herself? But for the most part, I think this episode wouldn't work without its ambiguity, as it leads to a lot of creative interpretations, which I think was intentional. With that being said, I can see why this episode didn't land for some people, especially if they approached it as a mystery to be solved instead of a journey, which is no fault of their own. Because of the high expectations I had for this episode, after my first viewing I was mostly thinking of ranking this episode underneath Boom, but the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it, and after a second viewing of this episode I really loved it. So I'm now thinking of ranking this alongside Boom in S tier.
Okay, so what do I think of 73 Yards 1 year later? So 73 Yards is one of my favourite episodes of this season and just this new era as a whole. I think I ranked it at S tier, and it might have been the only one at S tier for that series, maybe with Boom as well, I can't really remember. But it is one of my favourite episodes of this season and this era. I know for a lot of people this episode obviously doesn't work, and that's absolutely fine. I personally disagree with that, but I can see why it doesn't work for some people, because there are a lot of mysteries in this episode that don't get explained at the end of the episode, which for me personally I'm perfectly happy with, because I don't think they needed to be explained and I didn't want them to be explained, and I think they would have honestly ruined the episode if they were explained. Obviously now as well, since that review, we have also had the parts of 73 Yards that reappeared in the finale of season 1, which I think was fine. It was just a little touch on it that was kind of slightly linking back to the episode, but still not explaining the mysteries of the episode, which, like I said, for me, I personally am happy with. I didn't want the mysteries to get demystified or whatever in later episodes of this season or at the end of this episode, so for me personally it works. I can see why it doesn't for other people, but for me personally that's kind of what this episode is all about, and I think it would have personally been ruined if these things were explained at the end of the episode or later on in the season. However, I do feel like the political aspects of this episode weren't explored enough. Obviously, once again, they kind of come back into it in the finale, but they're still not explored that much there either, and they do feel a little bit rushed in this episode. Maybe the only other thing that I would have changed about this episode is Ruby having some sort of recollection about what she'd just been through throughout this episode. Obviously, once again, not having the mysteries explained, I don't want that, but it would have maybe been nice for her to have some recollection and memory of these things happening to her in this alternate timeline, similar to how when we had Turn Left, after Donna was returned to the normal timeline with the Doctor, she remembered everything that happened with her and had a little conversation with the Doctor about it at the end of the episode. I think it would have been nice to maybe have something like that in this episode as well. But that and the political aspects of this episode are the only thing that I wasn't the biggest fan of, and besides that, it's one of my favourite episodes of this era.
Okay, so at the start of this episode, we're introduced to our main character and audience POV, Lindy Pepperbean. I think Lindy Pepperbean was portrayed brilliantly by Callie Cook. I know some people have an issue with how unlikable she is, especially considering she's the main character of the episode. And while I do understand that, I think that Callie Cook and also the writing of this episode did a great job at making us think that as annoying as this character is, she could still be redeemed by the end of the episode. Although we obviously now know that didn't end up happening, which I think is a great twist that I'll get to later on in this review. As well, the Doctor and Ruby don't appear a whole lot throughout this episode, which I know some people have been slightly annoyed at because we just had a Dr. Light episode the week before. But for me, their presence is definitely felt a lot more in this episode, and I would agree with some of the early reviews of this episode saying that it's more of a Dr. Light-ish story than a Dr. Light episode. If this episode was completely Dr. Light, like the week before, I could see them being back-to-back as being a lot more of an issue than this episode actually is. Because like I said, I think their presence is felt a lot more throughout this episode. So the social commentary in this episode is probably my favourite part about this episode, and definitely the thing that surprised me the most about this episode, because like I mentioned, I initially thought the social commentary in this episode was just going to be about social media and being obsessed with being on your phone, not looking what you're doing, and just kind of scrolling through social media wherever you are, which I was really worried about, especially with it being written by Russell T Davies, who's in his 60s now. So I was worried that this social media commentary was going to be quite bad, and while this social media commentary is in there, and there's definitely a lot of those negatives in there that I was worried about, I personally think the social media commentary is actually only the smallest part of the social commentary in this episode, and I think a lot of people have misinterpreted the rest of this episode as just being that social media commentary, when in actuality I think the main point of this episode and the main social commentary is around social divisions, particularly with classism and elitism, with some people even misconstruing the ending of this episode as also being about classism and elitism. And while that definitely does play a part in the final scene of this episode, to me and a lot of other people it was very clear that that final scene is meant to be mostly about racism, but obviously still with hints of classism and elitism in there. But I'll get more onto the final scene later on. Now, this middle act of the episode is where one of my main issues with this episode arises, and that's the pacing issues, because this part of the episode is where the pacing really starts to meander a little bit for me, because the middle of the episode sees the characters mostly just sat in one place talking to each other over their screens. For example, I think the scene where Lindy Pepperbean is at work, along with the scene where she is hiding from the slugs and talking to the Doctor, both go on for a little bit too long, which leads to the pacing really meandering a lot in the middle. But I can understand this because obviously a lot of the episode does kind of need to consist of people talking through screens. It's just kind of unfortunate that they are kind of sat in one place for a long time. Now, the pacing of this episode definitely starts to pick up a bit again when we're finally introduced to Ricky September in the flesh. Ricky September is probably one of my favourite characters in this episode, because you really don't expect him to be the best person in this story, besides obviously the Doctor, because when we're first introduced to him in the cold open of this episode, he just seems like he's just like everybody else, dancing along to some music and posting these dances on social media and being trapped in his bubble like everybody else in Fine Time. But when we finally meet him, we realise he's not like that at all, and he actually spends most of his time outside of the bubble with his dot turned off. Now, when I was watching this episode, I realised Ricky was giving off a lot of Doctor vibes, as he was pretty much acting exactly like the Doctor would, which I didn't really understand when I was first watching the episode. But a lot of people have pointed this out since watching the episode, that this Doctor analogy was probably intentional, because it shows that Lindy would have trusted the Doctor if he was white, because Ricky acts pretty much exactly like the Doctor and Lindy trusts him straight away, which I definitely think was the intention behind this. Now, a lot of people still aren't sure whether or not we should like Ricky or not, because there's a possibility that he could also be racist as well. But for me personally, I definitely read it as him not being that, because as we know, he spends most of his time outside of the bubble, which is meant to be kind of an analogy for this echo chamber that they're all in. And we also know that he's spent his time reading up on a lot of history, and he also seems a lot less confrontational and more accepting when speaking to the Doctor, in my opinion. So for me personally, I do think Ricky is a good character, and I think the intention behind him was that he isn't meant to be racist like everybody else. We then get the reveal that the Dots have created the man-traps and have been killing the residents of Fine Time in alphabetical order, which if you've seen my first impressions video on this episode, you'll know I wasn't the biggest fan of this reveal. Now, I have slightly been swayed on the idea of them killing in alphabetical order now, after some discussions on Twitter and stuff like that, as people have pointed out that this kind of would make sense considering the Dot is basically a computer system and an algorithm, so it kind of makes sense that it would kill in alphabetical order, which I do agree with, and I have slightly been swayed on that opinion, but I still think it would have been a good idea to maybe have the reveal be something slightly different, such as the follow account suggestion that I mentioned in my first impressions video, just so that it could be something a little bit more satisfying and could play into the social commentary aspect of this episode a lot more. I'm also not too keen on the idea of the Dots creating the man-traps, because it kind of leaves questions of how they were able to create the man-traps in the first place and why they would create the man-traps, especially especially when we know the Dots can just kill people immediately if they wanted to. I did think maybe it was possible that the Dots would have let the man-traps in from the Wild Woods, but the Doctor does imply that the Dots created the man-traps, and if they had been let in from the Wild Woods, that wouldn't really explain how they're able to basically program the man-traps to eat them in alphabetical order. But then again, it does lead us to have this really good creature design of the episode, so it's not really a big flaw in my opinion. Now, we then also get the moment where Lindy basically throws Ricky under the bus by revealing that his surname actually begins with a C and that he changed it to September later on, leading to the Dots killing Ricky instead of killing Lindy, which I think is probably one of the main reasons why they chose to do the killing in alphabetical order thing, instead of having it be some other reveal that would be more satisfying to the social commentary of the episode. And this is obviously a great opportunity to show Lindy's true colours ahead of the final scene. And that leads us into the final scene, where we obviously learn that the residents of Fine Time don't accept the Doctor's help because they're all racist and they don't want to go with him because he's black, which I was surprised to find out that some people didn't actually get that that's what this scene was about. But like I said, this scene does obviously still have elements of classism and elitism in there, so I guess people who didn't see that weren't completely wrong. But for me personally, I think the racism in this scene was fairly obvious, especially with a lot of the lines about voodoo and contamination in there. And when you really think about it, and especially if you rewatch this episode, the hints about their racism become a lot more clear throughout, which I think is why this episode benefits so much with rewatchability. I think Ncuti's performance in this moment is absolutely incredible, especially considering it's the first thing he filmed for season 1, and it's definitely a defining 15th Doctor moment. It's probably the defining 15th Doctor moment of this season for me so far. I think my only criticism, and this isn't necessarily for this episode in particular, but for the season as a whole, is that he's cried in pretty much every episode he's been in so far, and while I definitely think it was incredibly warranted in this episode, I think it would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried in pretty much every episode so far. I think for me personally, the episodes where it makes the most sense were definitely The Church on Ruby Road, Boom, and of course this episode, but I think if he hadn't cried in the other episodes as well as that, this would have been a lot more impactful of a moment. But like I said, that's not really criticism of this episode in particular. I just think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried so much in previous episodes. This isn't me saying that I don't think this Doctor should be more emotional, I just don't think it was as necessary in episodes like Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, and if he hadn't cried in those episodes, it would have made this moment a lot more impactful for me. But like I said, this moment was still incredibly impactful for me and is definitely the 15th Doctor's most defining moment so far. In conclusion, Dot and Bubble is an episode that really surprised me. I expected it to be a boring and annoying commentary on social media and one of the weaker episodes of the season. However, although there is definitely some of that social media commentary in there, it's not the main focus of the social commentary in this episode. And I really liked the social commentary on class divisions such as class, elitism, and of course racism. And that final scene solidifies this episode as one of the best of the season for me, and a defining moment for the 15th Doctor. I wasn't expecting this episode to be ranked very highly, but after watching it, like I mentioned, I was pleasantly surprised by it. After my first viewing, I was mostly thinking this episode was a fairly mid episode with a great ending. However, after seeing some discussions of it on Twitter, similar to 73 Yards, I started to like it a lot more. And also similar to 73 Yards, I enjoyed this episode even more on rewatch and definitely think it benefits with watching it again. For that reason, this episode has become one of my favourite episodes of this season so far, which really surprised me. Because of that, I'm going to put Dot and Bubble in A tier, and I'm going to move The Devil's Chord down to a B tier.
Okay, so what do I think of Dot and Bubble 1 year later? So Dot and Bubble, like I said I think in the review, was a bit of a sleeper hit to me. It's the episode before going into this season that I was probably least excited for and least anticipating because of what I was expecting it to be. I personally assumed it was just going to be some boring kind of social media satire critique kind of episode, and was not expecting it to at all be this kind of criticism on racism and classism, which it ended up being, which I think the episode does really well, and it's obviously the best part of this episode. This is still one of my favourite episodes of this season, but I do think now that I've had more time to sit with it, most of the beginning of the episode there isn't much going on, and we are just kind of following Lindy Pepperbean around, kind of not doing a whole lot. So I can understand why some people might be a little bit bored at the start of the episode, but we do also get those hints of like microaggressions and stuff like that that clue us into the twist at the end of this episode and make it really good on rewatch. But I do think it is mostly just the ending of this episode that really carries this episode for me, because although I like the rest of the episode, That's the part that really works for me, and that last scene is just so incredible, and I still think that that scene is great and one of the best moments of Shooty's era, even a year after it aired. But like I said, the rest of the episode does still work for me as well, because we have those little hints throughout the episode that make that reveal work and make it even better on a rewatch. But it is mostly just that last incredible scene that works so well for this episode for me and puts it on those top tiers of episodes.
Okay, so like I just mentioned in the intro of this video, this episode definitely feels like more of a return to the status quo, and it feels like the first standard Doctor Who episode we've had since Space Babies. Every episode since that has been pretty experimental or has been Doctor Light, and I think that's definitely a downside of the shorter episode count, but like I said, this episode is like a return to the status quo, and it feels like it would fit right into the first RTD era in my opinion. We have the main villains of this episode being the Chord, who are a fun but fairly standard Doctor Who villain, which once again we've not really had since Space Babies, but they definitely had a much more unique and interesting motivation, with them wanting to cosplay, or more accurately LARP, all across the universe. However, they're not incredibly fleshed out or focused on in this episode, but that's because the focus of this episode isn't really on the Chord, it's on the Doctor and Rogue. Okay, so I think the introduction of the character Rogue is done really well. I think I've heard someone else mention it in this way, I can't remember who, but it feels like Rogue is the main character in his own story somewhere, and we're just kind of entering his story. You can kind of imagine him going off already doing these different bounty hunting missions and stuff like that. So I think that really fleshes the character out nicely. There's obviously also the scene in Rogue's spaceship, which I think was really good. It was another fun scene where we learn a lot more about Rogue as a character, and although I liked the moment, I do feel like the Kylie Minogue music, the moment with that goes on for maybe a little bit too long, but I did still enjoy it, like I say. Obviously in this scene as well, we also get the moment with the holograms of the Doctor's previous faces, where we get a look at Richard E. Grant's Schalke Doctor, or what is assumed to be the Schalke Doctor, but it could also be maybe the Curse of Fatal Death Doctor. And for me personally, I don't think this really means anything. I think it is just a fun little Easter egg for people that know about it, which I think is nice, but you know, it could also maybe be hinting at different timelines or parallel universes or something like that, but I personally don't think that's what it's about. Now, I personally think the Doctor and Rogue had really good chemistry, but I can sort of agree with some people who think their relationship was slightly rushed, as it was all in one episode. However, the scene with them connecting in the TARDIS, for me, really helped solidify their relationship. It's also nice to see a scene inside the TARDIS interior in this episode, because we haven't really been inside the TARDIS since the first week with Space Babies and the Devil's Chord, and I feel like that's really been missing this season, which is weird, especially considering how large and especially expensive this TARDIS set must have been. It's a little bit odd that we haven't seen it more because of that. Okay, so Ruby sort of gets a little bit sidelined in this episode in favour of focusing on the Doctor and Rogue, which is a bit unfortunate because we haven't had much of a sense of the Doctor and Ruby's relationship this season, particularly since Boom, besides the fact that they're just having a lot of fun, which makes it feel a little bit out of place when the Doctor calls her his best friend in this episode, although I do personally believe it because we know how long they've been travelling for now. It would have still been nice if we could have seen it more this season. With that being said, I still quite like Ruby's subplot in this episode. The conversations with Ruby and Emily are very good, but they are let down a little bit by the reveal of Emily being a Chord. But I think Ruby's subplot also nicely feeds into the end of this episode and fits really well with the ending, even if it does feel like she's sidelined for most of the episode. Okay, so when it comes to the ending of this episode, obviously we get the moment where the Doctor thinks Ruby has been turned into a Chord or has been killed and the Chord is playing her, which I think was a pretty good reveal that was set up well with the battle mode mention at the start of the episode. And I didn't personally see it coming straight away, but I did start to figure it out and put the pieces together before it was actually revealed to us. But with that being said, I do feel like it was a little bit unfair on the audience, because we saw the shot of them screaming and the lightning coming from the doorway, and we also had the moments where Ruby's neck is cracking, suggesting that she's a Chord, which don't really make sense when you find out that she isn't actually a Chord, and that she fought off the Chord that was pretending to be Emily. I also think the moment with the Doctor wanting the Chord to suffer after thinking Ruby was dead was personally very in character. We've seen it before in episodes like Family of Blood and Heaven Sent. However, it doesn't really make much sense, as we know he already changed the settings of the Triform before this point, so the fate of the Chord was already the same before he thought Ruby was dead anyway. Once again, we have the Doctor crying in this episode, which I think it makes sense for this episode personally, especially when he thinks Ruby is dead. It works less for Rogue because he only just met him, but like I said, I personally buy their chemistry. chemistry. But I still think this would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't already cried in every episode so far. For example, if he didn't cry in Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, where I personally don't think it was as needed as the other episodes. I also think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if the flashback moment we had already been in one of the episodes of this season before, instead of being written and filmed just for this moment. For example, if they managed to fit it in the end of Space Babies or The Devil's Chord or Boom or something like that. We obviously have the moment where the Doctor and Rogue kiss, which is very satisfying because it gives us a payoff for their relationship in this episode, but it's also there for Rogue to take the Triform activation device off of the Doctor. So it works both if you did or didn't buy their chemistry or relationship in this episode. We obviously have the moment where Rogue sacrifices himself to swap with Ruby on the Triform, which some people understandably don't like, as surely she could have just come off it some other way if Rogue was just able to shove her off. But personally, I think it's well set up, as we know there's a limit of only 6 people on the Triform, so if an extra person like Rogue goes on there, Ruby would be able to leave as it can only carry 6 people. And then we get the moment at the end of this episode where the Doctor is on about going to save Rogue one day. I know some people aren't happy with this moment, as it seems like the Doctor gives up trying to find Rogue very quickly, with the comments about different dimensions and not knowing his name, but I personally read this moment as him going to save Rogue one day when he finds out how to, especially with him parking Rogue's ship and wearing the ring as a reminder. In conclusion, I think Rogue was a fun episode of Season 1 and a nice return to the status quo, which I think was needed with most of the episodes being more experimental this season and with the shorter episode count not allowing for as many filler episodes. I think it was a very serviceable plot that would fit perfectly into the first RTD era, with fun villains in the shoulder. However, the villains clearly aren't supposed to be the main focus of this episode, with that being the relationship between the Doctor and Rogue, who I think was a great new character with good chemistry between the pair. For me personally, I think I'm going to rank this at B tier with The Devil's Chord, because although I really liked it, there are still some issues with it, and it is at the end of the day a fairly standard episode of Doctor Who, which I'm happy for because I feel like that was missing from this season.
Okay, so what do I think about Rogue 1 year later? So Rogue still for me is just one of those kind of bog standard Doctor Who episodes in this season, which I think for this particular season really works because we didn't really have a standard episode of Doctor Who in this season besides this episode. So it was nice to kind of have that a little bit for one episode in such a short run of episodes. But there's not really much of this episode that really comes to mind for me besides the relationship between the Doctor and Rogue, which obviously we've since got a little bit of a payoff to that in Season 2 in the finale, but it was just a quick green screen cameo from Jonathan Groff. And now that we're a year on and Doctor Who is basically on hiatus at the moment, I don't think we're going to get to see any more resolution to that storyline between the Doctor and Rogue, especially now that obviously Ncuti has left the role, which we weren't really expecting a year ago. So obviously we weren't probably expecting it to get resolved or for them to meet again in Season 2, which kind of did happen obviously with that little cameo, but maybe some of us were expecting a kind of sequel to this episode in Season 3, which obviously, even outside of this hiatus that is currently going on, was unlikely to happen with Ncuti leaving the role at the end of Season 2. And personally, I don't think I would really want to see it happen now if we're going to have a different Doctor. But like I said, that's kind of the only thing I really remember from this episode, or really have any interest in talking about, because the rest of the episode to me is very bog standard. There is also a couple of issues I have with this episode, with it kind of cheating the audience a little bit by making us think that Ruby has been killed. Obviously we know she hasn't been killed, but there's some sound effects and lighting and stuff in that particular moment that don't really make sense, because we know that she ended up fighting back against that shoulder and wasn't actually replaced by that shoulder, even though we see like the lightning effects and sounds of her like screaming and stuff like that, which doesn't happen in the flashback. And when we see her come out, there's like sound effects when she's like cracking her neck and stuff like that, which don't make sense because she's not a shoulder. So I think that does kind of cheat the audience a little bit and was a little bit unfortunate to see in this episode. And also we get a flashback to a moment with the Doctor and Carla Sunday in this episode from a moment we haven't seen before in any episode, and just feels a little bit shoehorned in, and it's kind of the product of this season being so short in the 8 episode length of this season and these new seasons for this era. But besides that, I don't think there's much I have to say about this episode 1 year later. I haven't actually rewatched these like just before making this video or anything, so for me this is one of those kind of forgettable episodes, but I still think it's a decent episode. It's just because of how kind of bog standard of an episode it is.
Okay, so The Legend of Ruby Sunday opens up with a red herring of S-Triad Technologies being an anagram for TARDIS technology, which I think was a clever thing to get out of the way in the cold open, as they were already expecting fans to have picked up on this, which they had, but they likely weren't expecting fans to have picked up on the correct anagram, Sutek, if you can even call that an anagram. But overall, I think this was a very clever thing to get out of the way, and to even have the unit team dismissing as something being so obvious and easy, because a lot of the audience already figured it out before this episode had even aired, and so it just shows that Russell T Davies already knew that would be the case, and it's just getting straight into it. We also immediately jump off with the Doctor and Ruby speculating as to whether or not Susan Triad could be the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan, adding to the red herrings in this episode. There's a nice moment between the Doctor and Kate Stewart where they discuss whether or not the Doctor wants it to be Susan, which I personally had hoped would lead to the Doctor choosing to go and see her at the end of the second part, which unfortunately doesn't happen. However, she still does get a mention, with him saying he'll eventually find her one day. My main issue with the Susan Triad stuff in this story is that once she's revealed to be a minion of Sutek at the end of the first part, that is all she is throughout the whole of the second part. There's no more mention of Triad Technologies or what that was all about, and Triad Technologies was set up in the giggle with RTD hinting that it would have some huge ramifications for UNIT, but ultimately it's never brought up again, with Kate Stewart offering Susan a job at UNIT at the end of the second part, which doesn't make sense knowing she's already a tech billionaire. Ultimately, most of this first episode is just set up for the next part, which for me leads to a pace that is very meandering, with not a lot actually happening, and it mostly taking place all in one location inside of UNIT, which doesn't feel really good on the pacing of the episode. The Sutek cliffhanger is probably my favourite part of this story. Even though it was speculated that Sutek would be the main villain of this story, I honestly wasn't sure if it would actually happen, because it was never actually leaked, just heavily speculated based on the Sutek anagram, the dust in the trailers, and so on. RTD was definitely right when he said to film the reactions to this story, because if I did, you would have seen that I went crazy because I just didn't expect it to actually happen. I also really liked the opening action sequence to Empire of Death. However, everyone dying at the start made it very clear that there was just going to be an inevitable reset button at the end of the episode. When Kate died, I assumed it was possible that that was it for her, but still unlikely. But as soon as Carla, Cherry, and Mrs. Flood, who's hinted at having future plans, died alongside Kate Stewart, I knew that this would all be reset by the end of the episode, which definitely lowers the stakes significantly. As much as I said I loved the cliffhanger to the first episode, I think the first episode could have benefited from the cliffhanger actually being the moment where Kate Stewart dies, because it means the stakes would have felt higher at the end of the episode and shown the power of Sutek, instead of just removing the stakes at the start of the next episode and making it obvious that there was inevitably going to be a reset button at the end. It also would have allowed for the pacing of the first episode to feel less meandering, as some of the slower moments could have been cut down to fit this moment in as the cliffhanger. As well as this, it would have also allowed us to spend more time exploring the desolation in the second part, as the opening to the second part would have been the ending to the previous part, allowing for more time for this desolation of Earth and other planets to be shown. The moments in the memory TARDIS is nice for the episode to take a bit of a breather, and I love the moment where the Doctor is screaming into the void of space, although this moment would have been more impactful if the Doctor hadn't cried in every episode so far. But it does also make it feel like this episode quickly comes to a halt and doesn't feel as large scale as it could, with us not really getting to see the desolation on Earth from a ground level and feel the stakes. We then have a bit of a time jump where we have a nice human moment with the Doctor and a woman who's all on her own and losing her memories. Like I said, this is a nice human moment for the episode, but once again it would have been nice to see more of the desolation outside of this scene, and ultimately this scene only leads to the Doctor getting a spoon to make the screen work better. We then see Roger Ap Gwilliam from 73 Yards appear on the screen, and for a second I was worried we were going to get answers about 73 Yards, which if you've seen my review on that episode you'll know is something that I don't want. Luckily this is just a small moment that doesn't ruin 73 Yards for me and ultimately has very little impact on that episode, which I'm happy about. Now I know some people are annoyed that this moment wasn't actually in 73 Yards, or even think that it may have been a deleted scene from 73 Yards, but for me this really doesn't bother me, as mandatory DNA testing is something that would be very in character for Roger Ap Gwilliam's authoritarian government, but it maybe still would have been nice to see this moment actually in 73 Yards. After the reveal of Sutek in the first part, I was really hoping we would see a more classic Sutek design in the second part. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, but I do think he looks a lot better in Empire of Death than he did at the end of Legend of Ruby Sunday. I particularly like the moment where he's leaning over the TARDIS like it's nothing and even spins it around at one point. With all that being said, Sutek is unfortunately barely in the second part and his presence isn't really felt, but when he is there, he is incredibly voiced by the returning Gabriel Wolf, who absolutely still has it at the age of 91. one. Now, Sutek's defeat is definitely one of the most disappointing moments in this episode for most people. I personally don't mind as much him being dragged by a big dog lead and flown through the time vortex. It's something that I think is a nice play on him being portrayed as basically a big dog, and is well set up with the reintroduction of the intelligent gloves and the introduction of the intelligent rope earlier on in the episode. And it also leads to some nice visuals as they're flying him through the time vortex, with the Doctor shouting to him through the TARDIS doors. However, it's definitely odd that they decided to defeat a villain who has been set up to be so powerful in this way, especially when we know that sending Sutek into the time vortex is how the Fourth Doctor originally thought he had defeated him in the first place, which ultimately ended up not being the case. I also think the explanation for how everybody is brought back to life is very half-baked and not well explained, leading to it ultimately just feeling like a big reset button that magically brings everybody back to life. I think Ruby's mother being revealed to be an ordinary person was definitely the right way to go, and was what I was hoping for. It's a good response to the terrible decision Star Wars made with The Rise of Skywalker by reversing the decision of Rey being a nobody and instead making her a Palpatine. But this does ultimately lead to some questions about things that were set up previously in the season relating to Ruby, such as it snowing around her whenever she thought about the night that she was abandoned, and why her mother was dressed in a cult-like robe when abandoning her at the church on Ruby Road. The moment where she points at the street sign is also very laughable, especially when it was established as being a changed memory earlier on in the season, and the sign not even being visible in the scene in the church on Ruby Road. Ruby's exit is one of my favourite scenes in this episode, and gives a perfect excuse as to why she needs to leave the show, at least for the time being, because as much as she wants to continue travelling with the Doctor, she has more important things going on at home. However, this moment is let down by two things for me personally. Number one, we really haven't had enough episodes or screen time with these two to really establish their relationship and chemistry, with this season only being 8 episodes long and them not always being together in a lot of the episodes. And number two, the Doctor crying, although warranted in this particular scene, is made less impactful due to the fact that he's cried in every episode up until this point, excluding 73 Yards, which he was barely in. And as mentioned earlier, I also think it would have been nice if the Doctor went to see his granddaughter Susan after this moment, as it would have made all the Susan teasing in the previous episode feel a lot less like just a red herring, and more like something that was linked to the themes and arcs of this season, and would have felt like a lot more of a satisfactory payoff to her mentions in both The Devil's Chord and the previous episode.
Okay, and what do I think about the Doctor Who Season 1 finale 1 year later? So this is a difficult one, because The Legend of Ruby Sunday I really liked, especially on first viewing, because it's a lot of build-up, and I think the reveal at the end of that episode, the cliffhanger, is done so well. But obviously for it to then lead into Empire of Death, which I personally am not a big fan of, it does kind of let both episodes down a bit for me. And I don't think Legend of Ruby Sunday would be that great on a rewatch. Obviously, like I said, I have rewatched it since it aired, but I haven't watched them literally just before making this video or anything, but I can imagine there's not a whole lot going on when you're rewatching that episode, because there's not a whole lot going on in the episode itself. It's all just building up to that cliffhanger reveal, which, like I said, is great, but it's let down by Empire of Death after it. And I think I was actually fairly positive in my original Empire of Death review, because when I first came out of the cinema watching it, even though I wasn't a big fan of some of the stuff, and particularly the resolution of the episode, I still had a pretty fun time when I was watching it for the first time. But the more I've kind of sat on this episode, especially a year later, the more I'm not really a big fan of it. I still don't know which I prefer out of Empire of Death or the Reality War. I can't remember what I said in my review for those episodes, or for the Reality War. I think I said I preferred Empire of Death, but only because of that final scene in the Reality War, because overall I had quite a fun time watching the Reality War as well, like when I initially watched Empire of Death in the cinema as well. And while similarly the ending of Empire of Death does let it down quite a bit for me, the very ending of the Reality War really lets that episode down a lot for me, even if it is literally just the last like 5 minutes or so. So they're both very similar for me in terms of kind of how the plots are resolved in these episodes and how much that affects the story as a whole for me. But like I said, for this and the Reality War, I did have a really fun time watching it in the cinema, even if the more I sit on it, the more I'm not a big fan of it. But honestly, I think besides that ending in the Reality War might age a little bit better for me than this episode does, but I guess we'll have to wait and see a year on from now for my 1 year later for Doctor Who Season 2 review, because I'm not going to know how well I think it's aged until we get to that point. So that's what I think about Doctor Who Season 1, 1 year later. Let me know what you think about it now that we're a year on from the season airing in the comments down below. Obviously, if you don't want to miss in a year's time my Season 2, 1 year later video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, but you'll be waiting for about a year for that to actually come out. But in terms of something more in the immediate future, this weekend, the first episode of my new series, Whovian Rewind Reviews, will be coming out on this channel, and I'll be covering Midnight for the first episode, just because we've obviously recently had The Well in Season 2, and I'm also going to be covering Kablam and Praxius in the near future, because obviously we've had Pete McTighe recently returning to the show to write Lucky Day, and he's obviously going to be writing or co-writing The War Between the Land and the Sea as well, so that's what I'm next going to be covering in that new series, Whovian Rewind Reviews. And like I said, that's going to be coming this Sunday, so make sure you subscribed if you don't want to miss that, or if you want to watch it right now, it is also available on my Patreon, which I'll make sure to have linked in the description down below. But with all that being said, thanks for watching.